I can tell you we are back and we've got somebody here from the Israeli army. South African. His name is Graeme Ipp and he contacted us and he said he would like to offer his story towards us. And I said, man, you're so welcome here because I think anybody of my generation will know that if we have a Jew boykie in the South African rugby team, the Springboks, we normally win everything. That is a tradition. So I really love to speak to the Israeli people, great admiration and respect. But it's not my story, even though I'm excited, like always, it's Graeme's story. Graeme, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you. I know you left as a major of all things in the Israeli army. Please tell us about it. How did you end up in the Israeli army?
Right, Chris, thank you very much. I really appreciate you inviting me here. It's the honor. The honor is all mine, as we say, to be on this channel with all the distinguished men and women that you've interviewed before me. So yeah, as you said, I was born in South Africa, and I grew up like all of us, expecting to go into the army at some point in time, and I had my plans and my ideas what I would do when I would get to the army, but unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, you can look at it in various ways. My parents decided to leave South Africa when I was 14 years old, and so that was the end of that. And I ended up in Israel, and in Israel also, just as in South Africa at the time, there was conscription, and as you well know, everyone goes to the army there. So that's how it happened. And I'd actually wanted to go to the parachutes in Israel. That was my original aim, but that didn't quite work out. So what happens when you go into the army there, they have quotas for the various units. And I was on the last day of the intake, and the quota was full for the parachutes, and so they told me I got my second choice. So in Israel, in the army, you've got three choices before you go in. You can list them. So my second choice was something which I honestly didn't think I'd ever end up using, but there it was. It was the Golanni Brigade. Now, just a quick word about the Golanni Brigade. It's a unit, one of the oldest units in the Israeli army, an infantry unit. And during the 50s and 60s, it had a kind of a reputation as I guess you could say, a second-rate unit. It wasn't like the elite or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination. Now, Israel, like every country, has got its various social issues and all sorts of political issues and all sorts of things, and there are dividing lines within society. And one of the dividing lines that they have are the ethnic origin of the Israelis. So you've got a whole big group which come from Eastern Europe originally. Those are called the Ashkenazi Jews. Then you've got a group which come from the sort of the Mediterranean countries, Arab countries, and countries like Iran. And those are ethnically slightly different. And in the early years of the state of Israel, those people who came from those Arab countries, generally speaking, they didn't come with modern skills and a modern education. So what happens in a situation like that is that the people who have got a better education and better skills, more advanced skills, they advance economically, and the other ones stay behind. So Golanni was a unit where people like that, the people from the Arab countries like Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Algeria, all of those countries, they ended up in Golanni, or the majority. Not only it wasn't segregated or anything. It just sort of like it became like the place for them to go, sort of thing. And then things began to change, and the unit had its fair share of battles and the wars and everything, and it gradually developed a reputation as a very effective unit. And a kind of a competition evolved within the army of Golanni and the paratroops. And the paratroops were like the so-called Ashkenazi unit of the Eastern European extract Jews. And the Golanni was the guys from the from the Arab countries, the poorer people, etc. And there's this kind of rivalry that developed, which was semi-healthy, I'll call it. And the rivalry exists until today. And I was a new immigrant in Israel at the time when I was going into the army, and there are quite a few new immigrants that come to Israel, and they almost always have a very difficult time in the army. So everyone was telling me before I went in, they said, you should just go to a unit. There was a kind of a unit where you could go as a new immigrant and you'd be in a platoon of other new immigrants, and it was much easier socially and psychologically and everything. They said you should go there. It's also infantry, by the way, but again, not the best. And I didn't want to do that. So I said, look, I'm going to go to the paratroops. I'm going to do my best, and I think I'll be okay. So anyway, the day came and I found myself not in the paratroops. And I was a bit worried. I thought this was more or less the end of the world at the time as a young chap who's 2 days in the army. But as time went by, I actually realized that this is a really, really good place to be, and a good place to build a career if you do want to build a career in the army. And by the time that I was in the Golanni Brigade, it was considered arguably the top infantry brigade in the Israeli army. And now just a short explanation on the infantry. So Israel's got a few infantry brigades, and the paratroops are one of them. I know in South Africa, the paratroops are considered a level perhaps above the regular infantry. In Israel, that's not necessarily the case. There are very few differences. The training syllabus and the whole sort of service plan that a soldier in the paratroops will go through in Israel is identical to the regular infantry, with the only difference being a jump course that they do to qualify them to jump, which lasts, if I'm not mistaken, 3 weeks. And the paratroopers occasionally jump for training, and very rarely do they jump in combat. I think the last time they jumped in combat was actually 1956, which is different from the South African army, where actually the South Africans had many paratroop drops in Angola. So that's just that. Now, what I thought I'd discuss here today was just not only about myself, but I thought it might be interesting for the viewers of the channel to hear a bit of a comparison between the Israeli army and the South African army, with an emphasis on the infantry and maybe a little bit of the special forces. So what I'll do, I'll do a bit of a sort of a description of what it's like for the what you call the troopie, the regular soldier in the Israeli army, and some other aspects which I know often people ask me about and people are curious about. So things such as discipline. So the discipline in the Israeli army is very different from the South African army, and people always ask me how that works. Then I'll also talk a little bit about some differences from the operational aspects, how the Israeli army works as compared to the SADF. I mean, the SADF now, it's unfortunately, it's gone with the dinosaurs, but it would have continued evolving just like the Israeli army evolves today. But at some point that obviously was cut off. So I will be discussing this subject with a look towards the 1980s and 1990s. So it's relevant more to those times, which I think is also for the viewers of the channel. That's also what interests them, because that's generally when they were in the army. So this what I will be discussing is a little bit less relevant to today. So look, if you go into the infantry, you're looking at at something like 5.5 months of basics, and basics is divided into two periods. You got your first period, which is roughly 2 months long, and there you're just learning the theory aspect of being an infantry soldier. You got all your lessons about the weapons and all that stuff. We do the firing ranges, learn how to shoot, and there's that obviously the basic military discipline and framework that you have to learn, and there's a sort of an introduction to the physical aspect as well. So the Israeli youth, generally speaking, doesn't play a lot of sport. It's very different from South Africa. So sport in Israel is not a big thing, unfortunately. And I mean, as I'm sure you all well know, Israel, when it comes to the Olympics, it's like if they win a medal, it's like the whole country's celebrating. It's like unbelievable. So the youth generally arrives at age 18 in the army, not as a South African would have done in the 1980s, like fit and strong and all of that. So they've got a big learning curve, you could say, or a big gap to fill. They've got to improve their physical fitness. So that first 2 months has a big emphasis on that. So we start at the very bottom, and there's a kind of a gradual increase, an incremental increase in the level of physical difficulty that's involved. One has to be careful with that, because if the increase is too rapid, then you have cases where the soldiers develop these hairline fractures in their bones, and it's a problem. And it still happens. I mean, it's as much as they try and avoid that sort of thing, it happens. So the first 2 months are like that. So for me, for example, the first 2 months were not difficult physically. It's just all about a sort of a mind game of getting used to the mentality and the language. I didn't speak the language very well at the time, and I would sort of be in a situation where the squad commander, what you guys call the corporal, he would arrive. In Israel, the equivalent is a sergeant. So he would arrive and he would start shouting at everyone and jabbering away, and I didn't understand what was going on, and suddenly everyone would start running, so I just started running with them. I didn't know what we were doing. That was the level of my Hebrew when I went in. So that was the adjustment for me. And then after that, what happens is one leaves the sort of the main basic training base, you go out into a remote part, like it's a sort of a semi-desert area, and it's just your company in a few tents, and you start the sort of the nitty-gritty infantry training, where you start learning how to fight. And you start with a really, really simple fire and movement stuff, the very basic stuff, from the single soldier, and then you go to greater and greater groups of soldiers, 3 or 4 soldiers, and then a squad, and then a platoon, and at the end you got the whole company does an exercise. You also do a bit of training to learn how to fight to clear trenches. So some of Israel's enemies use trench systems, the Jordanians in particular. Although obviously nowadays Israel doesn't really see Jordan as an enemy, but back in the 1980s we still trained so we'd know what to do if we ever had to go there, which we never have, happily enough. And another portion that we did was learning on the armored personnel carriers that we used, which were you guys, most of the listeners are probably familiar with the M113, the American armored personnel carrier. So we learned how to use that particular machine, which also ties in with something else. Later on, I thought I'd just do a quick comparison to 61 Mech and the Ratel. So yeah, that was our equivalent of the Ratel, which is, by the way, a very poor equivalent. The M113 is penetrated by 556. R4 will penetrate an M113. I think that the best thing about that platform is that it takes you from A to B and you don't have to walk. But apart from that, it doesn't do much good. The Israelis still... There was an understanding that it's a mistake to use that armored personnel carrier as a fighting platform, but still we trained to use it as a fighting platform. Why? I don't know. To this day, I don't understand it, but we would regularly train to use it as a fighting platform, although it was well understood that if you did that, it's basically suicide. So anyway, so that was part of basics. And during this whole period that you're learning how to fight, you're starting, or not starting because you start from the very beginning, but we do these marches which get ever longer. Each one is longer and longer and longer, these forced marches. And it culminates with the march which you have to do to get your beret. So our beret is a brown one. And we did a march of 72 kilometers for that. And it took us, I think, 11 hours and 40 minutes to do it, which it's not considered a poor show, but it's certainly not a record break. I think the record for our march was about an hour quicker than that. And still it's not easy. You're doing it with full kit, and you're carrying radios and jerry cans of water and stretchers. And the last few kilometers, you open the stretcher and you put one of the smallest guy in the platoon, you put him on the stretcher and you carry him as well. The first 5 kilometers, you do it at a run. So you run 5 kilometers, and you after that you've got another 67 to go. So and much of that you do running as well. So yeah, it's not an easy march, but everyone does it, and you get past it. And so that's the level that you reach after 5.5 months, to give you an idea. And you'd also be doing like a cross-country run of about, 10, 12 kilometers. That's also at the end of basics. That's the level where you'd be. And then after that, you join your battalion.
Well, listeners, as you've seen, we've changed the screens here. The man said his phone overheated or something, which happens. It happens. And he's now on a laptop or something like that. Graeme, I'm very glad actually for this pause, because I was thinking I have a question for you. As I said, I think of Israel as a place of sand only, and I think of it as a place which is extremely warm. But I do know it can actually snow there, and I do know it's not only sand. So when you guys were walking the 74 kilos march of yours, can you tell me what weight were you carrying? Were you carrying weapons? That's the other concern I have, because that's a country which is under attack. So would you, as a recruit like that, even be armed with live ammunition? And how was the temperature like?
Sure. So yeah, so as you said, of course, the weather there does vary greatly. I started my army service in the winter. In the Northern Hemisphere, obviously, it's the opposite from South Africa. So I started in February, and it was very cold. Not very cold, but it was cold. I mean, you'd get down at nighttime to about, 5 degrees, and it often rained. And in the day, it would be about 15, sort of thing. And that was where I did basics. Different parts of the country, the weather varies. And then when we finished the basics, this was the height of summer. So in the day, where I was, it was often between 35 and 40 degrees. And at night, it would be in the high 20s. So you'd be dealing with heat exhaustion, dehydration, all of those friends that we all remember from, I'm sure you guys dealt with all that stuff in South Africa. People who trained, obviously, who did their training at other times of the year, they'd be dealing with the weather at other times. So if you're in the far north of the country, as you said, it snows there sometimes, so you deal with snow sometimes, or it's just downright hot. That reminds me of another difference from South Africa. I think one of the things in the South African army, and correct me if I'm wrong, I may well be mistaken, but the South Africans trained the soldiers to be careful with drinking water, with the amount they drank, and water was often restricted from soldiers during training. In the Israeli army, that never happens. It's not allowed to do that. A commander is never allowed to hold water from the soldiers in training. So the water sort of discipline and all that stuff in the 1960s and 70s, I think in the Israeli army they did used to have that, but they had too many cases of deaths from dehydration and heat stroke. So they, from a safety point of view, they stopped it. And look, the only time where we've ever struggled with water was, for me, was in the 2006 war in Lebanon, when supplies were not getting through and we didn't have water. And that was the only time in my army service where water was a problem for me. But yeah, getting back to where we were before. So hopefully I've answered your question, Chris, about the weather.
Yeah, no, you
Yeah,
answered
okay,
about
good.
the weather.
So,
the terrain was sand, was it, or stones? Or how do you walk along a road?
Oh,
or
right. Okay.
where?
So the ground, the terrain is it's hard earth, but where we were then. In the far south, in the desert, you can get soft sand. It's very hard to march in soft sand. I tried out selection for the special forces. Like I was 3 days in the army or something, and I thought I was fit, but I wasn't fit. I hadn't prepared properly at all, so I didn't pass. But that was done on the beach, on beach sand, and not close to the water where it's nice and hard. We did it like with a part where it's very soft. So yeah, so yeah, generally we try and stay away from the soft sand if we can. um, but Israel is very rocky. It's hard ground, so generally the terrain is hard. Um, it's not flat like you guys had in Angola and Southwest. It's not like that. Almost not at all. There's a part of the country where it's like that, but most of it's not. So you're constantly going up and down and up and down when you're moving around. And you do have areas where the bush is quite thick as well. We do have areas with bush. I mean, it's nothing like Angola with the South African Army dealt with the bush there. It's obviously not comparable because the size of the country is also much smaller. So I mean, just to give you an idea, the size of Israel is the size of the Kruger National Park. So it's it'll give you an idea of the size. And even within that small space, you've got varying types of terrain and varying types of weather. So anyway, coming back to where I was before, so an infantry soldier finishes their basic training, and after that you go up to your battalion, and you've got another 9 months there, and you what's called I think in South Africa, I'm not sure. I know that you have something called an Oman, but in I don't know if you've got a Jongman, but in Israel you do. You've got those two kinds. So in your first half of your army service, it's a Jongman, and everyone sort of like laughs at you and stuff, and then and you do all the cuck jobs and everything, and then after that period of about 15 months in the army, you go off to a sergeant's course or a squad commander's course, where you are qualified as the equivalent as what you guys would be familiar with being a corporal. With us, we qualified as sergeants, or get the rank of sergeant. For those who finish that course, those who are not suitable for command, they go back to the battalion, and they are put in 2 companies in the battalion, which are wholly made up of soldiers who are Omana. One is the rifleman company, and the other one is the support company. And then you've got the guys who are considered suitable for command. Some of those go to be squad commanders in the battalion, and some of them go to be squad commanders in the basic training base, which is like the most sought after job. It's like that's what everyone wants to do. It's very rewarding. Everyone really enjoys it, and it also, for those who continue on to the officers course, it gives you a lot of command experience, junior command experience, which is very valuable. And then you've got a very select few which go straight from the sergeant's course without any term as being a squad commander. They go directly to the officers course. That actually happened to me. I was one of 4 in the company that was sent directly to the officers course. In retrospect, it was a mistake that I agreed to do that. I arrived at the officers course and I was inexperienced, and for various reasons, we'd also spent a lot of there was a time we were supposed to train intensively in the battalion prior to the sergeant's course, but because of the weather, this fell on winter, and we were in the north, in the Golan Heights, where it snows, and it rained almost every day, and there was thick fog. So you can't really train when there's weather like that. So we missed a lot of training. So I arrived at the officers course inexperienced. And what I should have done was to go and be a squad commander of younger guys, and I would have to sign on longer to do that, and still be an officer. But I didn't want to, which is just it's just I was just being a silly 20-year-old troopie. You know, I was thinking like a troopie. I wasn't thinking like an officer. So I should have signed on more, but I didn't want to. Anyway, never mind. When one's young, you make silly mistakes. So yeah, that's what happens. And then everyone goes their separate ways, and off you go. So that's that. Now I thought I'd talk a little bit about the discipline because, as I said, people ask me about that often. So I obviously didn't serve in the South African Army, but I've heard a lot of stories and I've read a lot of books and stuff, and so that's where my knowledge comes from. And I'm told, and from what I understand, the discipline in the South African Army was I would call it harsh, and it's not a sort of friendly place to be. Now, you also have things of the corporals and the sergeant majors and all those guys. They when they talk to the soldiers, they're very aggressive and they swear and they humiliate the soldiers and do all sorts of things like this. In Israel, you're not allowed to do that. If a squad commander humiliates a soldier in basics or wherever, that's his fast way out of a job. He's thrown out. So the squad commanders and all of the commanders know that they can be as tough as they want. They can make the training as hard as they want, but they're not allowed to humiliate soldiers. They're not allowed to swear at them. They're not allowed to abuse them for no reason. They're not allowed to punish them for no reason. And there's an independent ombudsman in the Israeli army where any soldier can file a complaint against the commander, and the complaint will be independently investigated. And the commander, he better have a good explanation for himself. And if he doesn't have a good explanation for himself, he's in trouble. And this stuff happens. It's not, you obviously here and there, you do have cover-ups. And sometimes when people are in trouble, they try and obviously protect themselves and that. But generally speaking, the system works. And when you train to be a commander, at the most junior level and up, it's instilled upon you that you have a responsibility for the well-being of your troops, and you have to be, it's a little bit like being a mother and a father for them. You have to be both of those roles. You have to look after them. You have to make sure that they've had enough to eat. You have to make sure that they've got a warm sleeping bag that's dry as far as it's possible. Sometimes it's not possible. For example, I spent 3 months in the winter maneuvers sleeping in a wet sleeping bag in 3 degrees temperature, raining and sometimes snowing. So that also happens. But as much as possible, that you have to look after the soldiers. The commanders have to give a very strong personal example. Like, for example, when they bring food, when they bring us food, everyone lines up, and the commanders are last in line. And if there's not enough food, the officers and the squad commanders don't eat. I mean, it doesn't happen often. It's actually quite unusual, but it's not unheard of. And it happens. You miss a meal. Tough luck. The soldiers have to eat first. And as a result of that, the soldiers follow you. And they will go with you through thick and thin. There's also another thing that's different, is that the authority of a commander is not through his rank. It's mainly through his competence. So it's not enough that you're a captain or a major or a lieutenant colonel or what you call a commandant, or they used to have a commandant. It's not enough with the bird droppings that you've got on your shoulder. You've got to also be competent. And the officer is not competent, the soldiers are not going to follow him. And that officer won't succeed. He won't last. I mean, they'll have to find him another job, and eventually he'll be out of the army. You can have sort of the rear echelon officers. Maybe it's not so much like that. There's much less of an emphasis on competency. But definitely when we're talking about the combat units, an officer has to be competent. And if he's not competent in the eyes of his soldiers, it's not going to work. In the reserves, it's even more so. So in the reserves, it doesn't even matter what your rank is. No one cares what your rank is. You got a job, and everyone understands what your job is. And if you're good at your job, they'll listen to you. If you're not good at your job, forget it. It's just end of the story. You know, that's the unit's not going to function. So I'm sure that's different from the South African Army. Now, other aspects of the discipline which are different. So we are in first, except in basics. In basics, it's different. In basics, it's similar to the South African Army, but after basics, you're on first name terms with your commanders, whether it's your squad commander or your battalion commander. In the infantry, in Golanni, we called our battalion commander by his first name. We'd even call our brigade commander by his first name. Brigade commander is a colonel, full colonel. I know that in the Armored Corps it's not quite as friendly as that. Like there, for example, they would call their brigade commander. There's a term. There's no English equivalent. It's like an acronym for brigade commander. In Hebrew, it's machat. You call him that if you address him. That's in the Armored Corps, which the Armored Corps have a reputation for being think like this, like by the book. Infantry, we're not by the book, especially in Golanni. We're the least by the book that there are. We take pride in that. It's like a thing. Anyway, so there's that. Now, some people might wonder sort of about what happens when soldiers do things wrong. I mean, soldiers are soldiers, and they often get up to mischief, or they just do stupid things or whatever, and they need to be punished. So to give you an idea, so if a soldier, if you have a readiness inspection and you've got a bullet missing from your magazine, that means for your weekend pass, you get a weekend pass of about 36 to 40 hours. You'll get an hour for every bullet missing in your magazine. That's an hour of your weekend pass. And a lot of punishments are like that for that sort of thing. Like if your weapon's not clean, if you're not shaven in the morning inspection. This is in basics. It's not after basic, but for example, in basics, if they decide that you're not properly shaven, you have to come at 2:00 in the morning to the rostered squad commander who's awake all night, and you have to come and report to him clean shaven. So punishment is often through sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation is a bit of an obsession in the Israeli army. It's like how they prepare you for war. From day one, it's all about sleep deprivation. They tried to change that, especially for soldiers in basics. They reached the conclusion that it was too harsh for them. So there's a rule that you have to give the soldier 6 hours sleep. But it's not always 6 hours. It's sometimes 5, and it's sometimes 4. And when I was in basics, they started with a 6 hours sleep stuff, but the commanders always found a way around it. So, if someone did something wrong, they would get extra guard duty, or they would, as I said, have to report in the middle of the night with polished shoes or polished boots or clean shaven and all that stuff. And in basics, we'd be sleeping 2 hours a night, and sometimes less. I mean, I'd see guys very tired. I mean, sometimes guys who especially had a lot of punishments and stuff because they, messed up and stuff, they wouldn't sleep the whole night, and they'd be sitting having breakfast, and their face would fall into the plate. They'd just fall asleep while they're eating breakfast. And the sleep deprivation goes on after basics. I mean, it continues throughout. Even on reserves, I did reserves until age 49, 50. And to the very last day. I mean, sleep is the last thing you do. When you've finished everything, you've cleaned your stuff, you're ready, you've studied what you need to study, you've done what you need to do. Then if you've got nothing left to do, which is not very often in the army, then you can go to sleep. In the second Lebanon War where I served, for example, there. For the first stretch that we went over the border into Lebanon, we were there for 8 days. Without exaggeration, I think I slept less than an hour in 8 days, maybe an hour and a half, maybe. I mean, you come out of there, you can hardly function. I mean, you fall asleep standing up, literally. But it's like that. So that is with sleep. So I've made a few notes here. Let me just check my notes. Yeah, so the sort of discipline revolves around your professionalism as an infantry soldier. So especially in Golanni, where I was, you and you're also judged not only by your commanders, but you're also your peers. So if you mess up professionally, like as a soldier, you're going to have to answer to your peers, not only to your commanders. You're expected to have what they call operational discipline. So that means if you're lying in an ambush and it's not your turn to sleep, you stay awake. You stay awake because you better stay awake. And if you don't, you have to answer to everyone for it. So it's sort of it's a lot like that. If sort of the ultimate punishment without, I think you call it in South Africa, going on orders or something like that. The ultimate punishment that the squad commander or the platoon commander can give you is denying your weekend pass. So generally speaking, that would happen if you fall asleep or sit down or eat on guard duty. That's the classic way to earn that punishment. And it's a dreaded punishment. Everyone's terrified of losing their weekend pass. And because Israel's so small, it's not like South Africa. You can go home. The soldiers go home quite frequently. So something like once every 2 weeks, you have a weekend pass of 36, 40 hours. Sometimes if you're lucky, it's 2 weekends, you go out, and then 1 weekend you stay. And if you're unlucky, you stay 2 weekends and you go out one. So that's how often it is. When you're on the border, sometimes you go home much less. You go home maybe once a month for 36 hours, which is that's considered like pretty rough. But it happens. It's not unusual, especially for the infantry. For more serious things, like if a soldier refuses an order, so sometimes soldiers decide that they don't want to serve in a unit like that anymore. It's too hard for them. They don't like it or whatever. They decide they're going to cause problems and they're going to get themselves kicked out the unit. So they start doing things like, one of the things they do is to refuse orders. So something like that, you'll go to the detention barracks for 14 days or 21 days. If you go AWOL, so there's two definitions of AWOL. There's AWOL up to 14 days, and there's AWOL from 14 days and up. So for the first one, you'll go to the detention barracks for about usually 14 to 21 days again. And for longer than that, it's 28 days and up, sometimes up to 56. It's probably the longest I've heard of someone going to the detention barracks. If it's very unusual, but if a soldier commits a serious crime, like I don't know, like a violent crime or something like that, they would then go to the detention barracks like for a long period of time. Like I'm talking drug offenses, like serious drug offenses, like drug trafficking or something like that. They'd go for years, and it's in the detention barracks. I mean, it's not like a civilian prison. It's not fun. But those things are unusual. It's very rare that those things happen. And of course, you asked about firearms. So we get a rifle from the first day of basic training. You get your rifle and ammunition. We actually on the first morning of basic training, we had a guy commit suicide in my company, shot himself. Yeah. He was I never knew him. He was from the other platoon, and now one of the other platoons. I was told that there's a period before basics, like 2 or 3 weeks before basics, where you just run around the base and you like painting fence posts and pulling out weeds and doing stuff like this. So during that time, there was a quartermaster sergeant who was a bit of a sadist. He was a horrible guy, really nasty guy, and he was giving this kid a hard time. And there was a rumor that he because of giving such a hard time, he committed suicide. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. Anyway, the same quartermaster sergeant, afterwards, when he got to the battalion, he was so unpopular. There's something called blanket. Blanket is a kind of a punishment which your peers give you. So if someone's like really bad, what they do is they come to him while he's sleeping in the middle of the night. Everyone holds a blanket over him, they smash him, they punch him and scoop him. And so this is kept for someone like this. So this guy was a sadist. So when he got to the battalion and no one was scared of him anymore, he got the blanket. And then he got kicked out. I mean, he couldn't stay in the army. He was too scared to stay, I think. He left. That was the end of him. But anyway, so that's answering your question about the firearms. And yes, and we did the marches obviously with a rifle. You never leave the rifle. The rifle's on you all the time. You're not allowed to let the rifle off you. You have a strap on the rifle. And wherever you go, whatever you do, the rifle's on you. If you're sitting in a bus going home on a weekend pass, the rifle's on you. You go home with a rifle. The army's reduced that significantly. Now soldiers go home much less with the rifles because crime in Israel has increased over the last, say, 15 years or so, and more theft of soldiers' weapons occurs from their houses when they're on leave. So now the army doesn't really want, they try and keep it to a minimum of soldiers going home with their rifles because of that. Not because the soldiers being irresponsible, but just because the criminals they get to know who's serving in the army. The neighborhoods know, everyone knows what's going on in the neighborhood, and so is now in the army. So the bad people in the neighborhood, the word gets around, and they go and they break into his house and they steal his rifle when he's out with his friends. So that's what happens nowadays. And the weights we carry, so in a forced march like that, we're carrying anything of your own personal kit. You're carrying about 15 kilos. You have certain marches where you carry heavier weights, all the way up to maybe 40 kilos. And you have marches where you do full kit with a stretcher, either with sandbags or the smallest guy in the platoon on there. Yeah, so the marches are like that. They're sort of like they vary like that. Yeah, so that is the subject of discipline. Now to talk a little bit about the differences between the two armies. So the one thing that often strikes me is how South Africa has the separate medical service. I've never fully understood this. I think it's unique in armies all over the world. In Israel, the medical service is it's part of the logistics. It's a logistical arm, just like your maintenance and your signals and whatever. It's just part of it's a logistical problem that has a logistical solution, and that's all it is. And not detracting from the respect that the doctors and the medics get. Of course, everyone holds them in the highest regard, but they don't have their own separate branch of service. And by the way, I just wanted to say before I continue on with the comparison between the two armies, I have nothing but respect for the SADF, the greatest of respect, and I've got I'm not coming from a place where I'm criticizing anybody or anything. And later on, when I talk about certain units or operations that happen in Angola, please, if any of the people that participated there or the commanders, if it has any kind of a reflection on them, my intention is not to criticize anyone, heaven forbid. I mean, I wasn't there. My only sources of information are books and things like that, and this channel. So, I mean, my knowledge is very limited, and I'm the first to be aware of that. And I also don't think that the Israeli army is better than the South African army or anything like that. I think both armies are, in certain aspects, are very good, and certain aspects are less good, and both have their advantages and disadvantages. Okay, enough said. The next thing that's different about the two armies is logistics. So here, the Israeli army, the logistics are notoriously bad. In Israel, you have your manpower, which is you can grade manpower. You've got the very best manpower, like the people who go to be pilots and reccees and stuff like that, and then it goes down from there. So in Israel, the lower sort of, I don't know, the lower third or the lower quarter or the lower half, I don't know what it is, but the sort of the less better portion of the population generally serves in the logistics, and the logistics functions accordingly. I mean, just to give you an example of logistics, so in the 2014 war in Gaza, I was placed with an armored brigade, which is actually the school of armor, which in time of war they sort of they have some reserves that join them, and they sort of set themselves up as an armored brigade. So I was with these guys. It was not my unit, but they needed the role that I was performing, so that I was sent there. And I mean, this is a unit which has a fixed base in Israel, and they've got a big kitchen with lots of chefs and cooks and a sergeant major of the kitchen and all of these people. And they just they sent them home. It's war, and they sent them home. And they gave us sea rations, the dry rations to eat, and bottles of water, and that was it. That was food for a month. And I just couldn't understand it. I mean, it's not that we've crossed the border. We haven't traveled 300 kilometers to Kasinga. There's no reason to send the cooks home. They can come and bring the kitchen here and make food properly for everyone. They didn't. They just sent them home because we were under fire. We were being mortared. And I think they were scared that the cooks would run away or something. I don't know what the story was. Anyway, all the cooks, please forgive me. I don't want to say anything bad about anybody. But anyway, that was the story there. The next thing is marksmanship. So the marksmanship in the Israeli army is not nearly as good as the SADF. I mean, I know the SADF have a very high standard with marksmanship, goes all the way back to the tradition of the Boers in the First Boer War, Anglo-Boer War, 1881, where the Boers outshot the British at every opportunity, and again in the Second World War. So, yeah, no, Israeli army, not great. For example, if I think of the amount of times that I was on a firing range shooting at targets further than 100 meters away, I can count probably on one hand in my whole army service. And the reason for that is that contacts in our part of the world, in our history, the contacts with the enemy have always taken place at close ranges. I don't know why. I mean, if maybe it's just because I don't know. I can only speculate why that's been the case. But generally, contacts take place at relatively close range, and the army trains accordingly. So we don't train to shoot very far and as well as the South Africans did. I mean, we do have our snipers and everything, but look, to be honest, I mean, I'm sure the snipers in the South African army are better, and the American snipers are better, and the British snipers are better, Canadians are better. I'm sure all the snipers are. And if my Israeli friends hear me saying that, some of them might be very angry with me. I'm sorry, but I think that's true. Another difference, artillery. So South Africa led the way with the G5, the 52 caliber gun barrels, and Israel is still with a 39 caliber 155 millimeter. So you guys, early 1980s, you're shooting to 40 kilometers. We're shooting until today at 20. The reason for that, I believe, is because the artillery in Israel support the brigades, and a brigade has a certain depth to which they fight, and then a further depth to which they, I don't know, to use a literal translation from Hebrew to English, it's we take an interest. So you fight to a certain depth, and then another certain distance beyond that, where you have to know what's going on. And the 155 millimeter 39 caliber guns are sufficient for that, but it's a short-sighted way of thinking about using artillery, because you do have to shoot to the depth. I think the Israeli plan is, for when it comes to taking care of the depth, they've got the Air Force, but I think that's a mistake. I think Israel should, long time ago, should have a gun which is like today there's several guns like the G5. For a long time it was the only one like it, but now there's several, and the Israelis need a gun like that too. Another difference is the length of service. So that's also undergoing change. In my time, it was 3 years for boys and 2 years for girls. Now it's less by gender; it's more by the role you perform. So now, depending on what you do in the army, depends on how long you serve. It's up to 3 years. If you're an officer, you have to sign on for another year at least. Sometimes it's more. Some the special forces, like our equivalent of the Rekkies, the Sarat Matkal and the Shahetet, which is the Navy commandos, those guys do about 5 years altogether at the very least, and often they do more. Pilots do, if I remember correctly, 7 years, and so on and so forth. Another thing I noticed, which was interesting, was that South Africa, the SADF had 2 intakes a year. And again, please, I stand corrected if I'm wrong. Please correct me. But there were operations in Angola which were shortened or had to be ended because the Oman had to be demobilized and sent home, and the new guys still hadn't come in yet. So in Israel, that's inconceivable. I mean, you can't have a situation like that. So the solution is actually not too complicated. What you do, you have, instead of 2 intakes a year, you have 4. And every battalion, every 3 months, has a new intake with the size of a company. So every 3 months, a battalion is getting a new company. It's a company is finishing and a new company is coming in. So the battalion can constantly, if they need to fight, they can still fight. It doesn't matter. One company will leave, a new company will come in, and the battalion continues fighting. You don't have to stop anything. So I think that was a sort of a real planning mistake or failure or something on the part of the SADF. I don't understand why they didn't solve that issue. Another thing about the Israeli army is there's a very strong, and this might exist in the SADF or may have existed in the SADF, I don't know, but there's a very strong culture of debriefing. So you have your briefing, then you do your exercise or your operation, and then you have a debrief afterwards, and you learn lessons and you record lessons that were learned and you implement them for next time. And the next time you go and do the operation, you say, hey, what were our lessons last time? Let's see that we're implementing. And this way, the army is constantly improving and improving and improving and learning. And that's, I mean, people say the Israeli army is very good. I mean, it's probably why. It's from that. Not only from that, but also from that. There's also a culture in the Israeli army that junior commanders can criticize senior commanders without fear of retribution. So if a second lieutenant thinks that the battalion commander has made a mistake, in the debrief, he stands up and he can say it. And he doesn't have to worry. As long as he can explain himself and he can ground his opinion in sort of solid professional reasoning, perfectly fine. It's even expected. And I can take it to an extreme. Again, to the 2006 Second Lebanon War, which was probably you could describe it as a disaster. It was a terrible mess. It was a huge failure by the senior leadership of the Israeli army. And at the time, for the first time ever, the chief of staff was from the Air Force. And the thinking had been that this guy would come in and he'd shake up the army and he'd improve the standards of the army, because the Air Force sort of is considered to operate at a higher standard of being organized and orderly and efficient and all the rest of it. So they wanted to make the rest of the army more efficient, so they got the chief of staff from the Air Force. Anyway, this guy didn't know what he was doing when it came to maneuver warfare, and he made incredible mistakes, and he had to resign at some point. But he came to our brigade at the end of the war, after the war, to speak to all of the officers, and we were convened in a kind of a lecture theater, and it's pretty respectful, and the guy was very humble, and which is unusual for Air Force pilots. The Israeli Air Force pilots are not humble people, very much not humble people. This guy, suddenly he was eating humble pie. And look, hat off to him. He had guts to come and face us, and he basically said to us that he acknowledges that as they should have, and the mistakes were made, blah blah blah. But look, officers there, and these weren't young officers, they're reservists, so they're like captains and majors. They stood up and they basically said to him, look, you stuffed up. This was a disaster, and this was nothing to be. There's nothing to be proud of here. And they said it to his face. Maybe not in as harsh terms as I've just said, but words to that effect. I mean, it was clear to everyone. So that's with respect to that sort of culture. And then, of course, you've got your initiative of the junior commanders. Junior officers are expected to take initiative, and if their orders are X, and then in the middle of the fight they see that the option Y is the better one, they're expected to go with option Y, contravene their original orders. Of course, they must be able to explain it afterwards with sound reasoning. But even if they make a mistake and it doesn't work out, it's still okay as long as they can explain what the reasoning was behind their course of action. Okay, next one. So the other thing is the use of reconnaissance. So again, this is something I noticed with reading about the SADF in Angola. So, I mean, the SADF had amazing recce units, which were like, I mean, they were the best in the world when it comes to what they did. But there was a gap in the reconnaissance units, and often the what we call battlefield intelligence was severely lacking, from what I can understand from reading. For example, like in Operation Daisy, the 61 mech came to this, reached the SWAPO base, or the area where the SWAPO was supposed to be, and the SWAPO had all disappeared. Or they came to bases which were obviously not, they'd been deserted for a long time. I mean, there were still munitions and stuff kept there, but the bases themselves were deserted. I mean, that's an intelligence failure. I mean, that should have been found out before, just by sending someone there, whether it's 3-2 battalion or whoever. But I can only say how Israelis would have handled that sort of objective. They would have sent a reconnaissance unit first, beforehand, to first of all go and see where the enemy actually is and how many of them are there, and they would sort of maintain contact with them until the main force was ready to start their business. Another thing was the reconnaissance screen. So again, I use Operation Daisy as an example because I read quite a lot about that one. So there, 61 mech drove a long distance into Angola, and there was no reconnaissance screen going in front of 61 mech. I mean, the first Ratel was one of the platoon commanders who was navigating for the battalion. So if that was an Israeli unit, there would be a reconnaissance unit going first. And not only that, they would also be marking the route. So in Operation Daisy, there were 2 or 3 platoon commanders who were very sharp navigators, very, very good at what they did. They were chosen to navigate for the whole battalion, and that's what they did. They took the battalion from point A to point B to the jump-off line in Angola, and that was their job. So that's a mistake. I mean, from an Israeli point of view, that the fight, he needs to be focused on the fight and what he's about to do. He shouldn't be busy with leading the way for the force, with navigating and all that stuff. There has to be a dedicated unit for that. And that leads me to the makeup of 61 mech. So, for example, if the person who set up 61 mech would have been an Israeli officer, he would have done it as follows. So 61 mech, you had A, B, and C companies. Then you had the mortar platoon, and you had the anti-tank platoon. So those 2 platoons would have been merged into another company, call it D company, Delta company, and they would have those 2 platoons plus a sapper platoon and a reconnaissance platoon, and there would be a company commander who would be the best company commander in the battalion. He would command that Delta company, and the soldiers in Delta company would be Omana, and they would be the best Omana. And there might even be a selection to get into that company, and that would be the elite company of the battalion. And the reconnaissance platoon would be responsible for doing the reconnaissance screen, going ahead of the battalion, finding the way, marking the way. They wouldn't use toilet paper like they did in Angola. They would use what we use are, we call them, this is a translation, sort of translation from English, we call them stick lights, but I think in English you call them Kaialoom lights. They're like plastic tubes, and you snap them like this, and there's two chemicals that mix and they glow in the dark. So we use those things. They come in a kind of a paper, which is almost like a kind of a foil, so you can tear part of the paper open. So we tear it open so it's only facing the side of our troops. So only we who are coming to it, we see it. And on the other side, where the enemy supposedly is looking, they can't see it because that side of the illumination device is still covered and hidden. And you use these things, you hang them on the trees, or you put them on the ground or whatever, and then everyone sees the way and you mark the way like that. Toilet paper can just blow away. It can blow away, or it can move, or I don't know. It's not the way to do it. Anyway, let me see what else. Okay, so another difference is this whole issue of when infantry should fight mounted and when should it fight dismounted. So in Angola, and again, I have to be careful when I say this because I wasn't there. But from what I understand, and to stay on the rattles and fight mounted, and a lot of the casualties, like I heard this terrible story of the gentleman who's been on your channel who was hit by the 14.5 anti-aircraft shell in his back, and until today he's got a terrible wound in his back and everything. So those sort of things that happened because the rattle was used as a fighting platform. To an extent, it can be used as a fighting platform. It's reasonably well armored. I mean, against AK-47, it's fine. And it's got a nice 20mm cannon. But when you're coming up against a 14.5 or a 23mm anti-aircraft gun, it's not the right platform. I mean, the right way to handle an anti-aircraft gun like that in the bush, and some of your listeners may disagree with me, and I'm happy to, I'm the first one who wants to be corrected if I'm wrong, but the way to handle a threat like that is by dismounted infantry, where the infantry use their advantages and their skills and their field craft and their camouflage and their stealth and everything that an infantryman can do to get through the bush and approach that anti-aircraft gun and knock it out. The moment you go in with a rattle, you're just a big fat target. And all of your men are concentrated inside, and those shells are going to come through the rattle and they're going to do a lot of damage. And that's what happened. It's a human nature thing, and we see it in the Israeli army also, where there's this kind of desire for self-preservation. So when you see soldiers, when they're supposed to be spread out, when they're marching towards the battlefield or whatever, and they start bunching up, that's because they bunch up because they want to be together. It's like a kind of a subconscious thing. They know that they should be spread out, and they know why they should be spread out, but they still bunch up. It's the same with the drivers on the trucks, like in 1987 in Modular and Hooper and everything, and the MiGs were bombing the convoys. I read of how the drivers used to still bunch up in the driving. Again, just because they sort of like, you feel safer when there's more, when you're close to everyone else. You also feel safer when you're inside a vehicle. You've got this perception, you've got this impression of being protected. Now, you are protected against shrapnel and AKs, but you're not protected against the 14.5 anti-aircraft gun. The Israelis have the same issue. In the 2006 Lebanon war, what we did was the Hezbollah, the Shiite enemy that we were fighting there, they were shooting anti-tank missiles even at individual soldiers. So if you were seen outside during daylight, they would hit you straight away. So during the day, we'd hide. We'd have to camouflage ourselves and hide. And often what the soldiers did, we hid in houses. I mean, us too. We hid in these houses, empty houses, which is a mistake because it's easy for the enemy to hit you there with an anti-tank missile. You have the false sensation of being protected. but you're just making yourself an easy target. So there was one incident where a reserve unit of paratroops was in a village next to the village where we were, and two companies went into this big double-story house and filled up the house. I mean, the house was packed with soldiers, and the company, it was Israel's elite, the IDF's elite reserve unit. This unit, and they had a lot of they've got a big sapper section there, and they were carrying all of the explosives, and they were hit by a number of anti-tank missiles, and the sappers explosives blew up, and a whole lot of them there were 9 of them killed there, and more than 30 injured, and our battalion went to rescue them. We pulled them out and carried them to the border and got them out of there. We rescued them, but that happened because they were all packed in a house instead of being in the bush next to the house. They thought they were safe, but it was exactly the opposite. So, yeah. So basically, we're getting back to my original point. So the way if an Israeli was commanding 61 mech or the brigade level above, the way they would have done it was they would have used the rifles to bring the soldiers to reasonably close to the swapper area, dismount and continue on foot. You can use the rifles maybe as a form of a diversion or deception, or if you want to drive the swapper from one area and drive them in another direction, maybe come from 3 sides and push them, and then you'll have your infantry quietly waiting on the 4th side and like do a nice ambush like that. That's the sort of way that Israelis would use the mechanized units, rather than just taking a mechanized battalion and just doing a mechanized assault on SWAPO terrorists. It's like hitting a fly with a sledgehammer. Not only that, but the fly is not such a fly. He can sting you also. Another thing which I noticed was in the latter part of the border war, like say 1985 to 1988, was when the South African Air Force lost its air superiority, and it was actually the Cubans and the Angolans gained air dominance, which must have been it must have been terrible for the soldiers on the ground, the South Africans. I can only imagine. But I've often I've often wondered why did they allow that to happen? I mean, it's not just a case of, okay, they didn't have the more modern fighters, and that's obviously understood, but there's other ways of handling a threat like this. Now, again, as an Israeli, if I was posed with a problem like that, the way I would have handled it was I would have used a combination of artillery and recce's to attack the surface-to-air missile batteries, radars, and Air Force base. The main was at Mononge. You call it Mononge, that town in Angola. So that base, for example. So there's ways you can do it. Again, I wasn't there. There may be 1,001 reasons why it was not possible and it was not practical. But for someone like myself who's disconnected from the whole thing and wasn't there, the obvious solution to me appears to be using a combination of G6s, maybe even G5s if it was practical to bring them there, and recce's to attack those things. And you don't just attack them any old time. You attack them by sending in bait. So the bait would be like a Canberra aircraft to do a photo reconnaissance thing or something like that, and the aircraft around the airfield, and then you hit them. Yeah. Then there's another thing I noticed, the use of the recce's. So the recce's had many very interesting operations that I've read about there. So one of them was hitting the logistics that were coming in from the coast. There was that one town, I think it's called not Lubanga, that's not on the coast. Namib is the port, I think. From there, and the recce's at times would hit them, the railway lines, the bridges, the tunnels, all sorts of things. But it was conducted in a campaign which was detached from all of the other fighting against SWAPO. So again, I may be wrong, but the way I think it should have been done was that those raids against the deep logistics at Lubango and Namib and on the railway lines and all that, that should have been done at the same time as you were doing an Operation Daisy or an Operation Meerbos or Hooper or Packer. You do it just then, not sort of just any old time sort of thing, or in the dry season or whenever, obviously those are constraints that you have, but you also plan your Operation Meerbos in the dry season for the same reason. Yeah, so that is what I had noticed. Two other things. So from reading about the border war, there were very few instances where the SADF used deception. So the Russians, for example, they've got a whole term for this. They call it maskirovka. It's like a whole doctrine in itself of using deception on the battlefield. And when you're small and you've got limited resources, like the SADF was, you have to use deception. Not using it, you're just throwing away an opportunity. And I saw from what I was able to understand, there was very limited use of deception in that war. Another thing that wasn't done was using the local population as a source for intelligence. They were never used as a sort of a human resource. Like, again, if the Israelis were there, they would have a whole intelligence set up that their sole task was to be in touch with the people who lived, all the villagers that lived in those kraals, and they would know them individually. They'd know the people there, and they'd have intimate connections with them, and they'd be helping them with tools or food or money or weapons, even, or all sorts of things, and they would sort of be winning the hearts and minds like that. And getting information. And from what I understand, again, I may be wrong, but from what I understand, there was no attempt to get information from the local population in Angola on an ongoing basis. There was very little field intelligence. I mean, I read about the intelligence being collected by using the forward artillery officers, the guys who spot the artillery. So their job is to spot artillery. Their job is not to collect intelligence. I mean, they can make a contribution here and there, but it's not their job. I mean, there should be units. Again, it's your reconnaissance platoon of 61 mech. That's them. That's their job, is to collect battlefield intelligence. Yeah, so those are the differences. Now, I've also written a book about my service, and some of the things which I've described there are also mentioned there, and whoever's curious can also read the book, and they might find it interesting. Long periods of my service were not very eventful. I was sort of a lot of my service covered quiet years in Israel, like from 1987 to the late 90s. There was a time in Lebanon that it was pretty hectic. Israel was losing about 35 soldiers a year in Lebanon in the 90s. But it just so happened that when I happened to be in Lebanon, it was never hectic like that. So I never experienced that. I did experience all of the fighting in the Palestinian areas, the Palestinian uprisings, the 2006 Lebanon war, as I said, which was an absolute disaster. And I mean, that just talking about that war and why it was a disaster, and I'm sure people will be curious when I say it was a disaster, they want to know why. But look, the answer to that question, it's a whole session in itself. I mean, it's an hour and a half explanation talking about that. So I won't go into that now. And again, in 2014, in the war in Gaza, which was also sort of a very eventful thing. What I did, I served in a number of units. So I was in, as I said, the Golanni Brigade. And then after that, after I did my officer's course, I was sent to set up a company which later on became another infantry brigade, one of Israel's infantry brigades today. It was a long process. It took about 20 years to go from company size to brigade size, but I was right there in the beginning, in the first, the second company, I think we were. And that company was attached to an armored brigade.
And then when I finished my regular service, my permanent force, I went into the reserves, and there I was in a reconnaissance company of an armored brigade. So until recently, every armored brigade in Israel had a reconnaissance company, whose job, we had 3 missions. So one mission was to do what I said 61 mech should have had, just to lead the force, lead the armored force, and mark the way for them. The other thing we did was to collect battlefield intelligence, setting up observation posts on the periphery of the brigade. And the third thing we were responsible for doing was to detect chemical weapons that the enemy may have used, which thankfully, thank heavens, we never had to do. I mean, not in real life, but in training we did. And it was clear that if we ever had to do it, it wasn't going to end well for us. So I was in the armored reconnaissance companies for a while. I went all the way up to the role of acting company commander there. And then to become a company commander, I would have to do a company commander's course, which would take 2 months plus. And at the time I was in university, and I couldn't study at university and also take 2.5 months off to go to the army. So I had to pass on that opportunity. And during the years, the Israeli army downsized, and a number of armored brigades were dismantled, and including mine. And funnily enough, we'd come to our base to be where it was about to be decided what was going to happen with everyone after our unit was disbanded. So anyone over age 35, they said, you can go home, you can stop doing reserves if you want. And I was 39 at the time, so I didn't want to stop. And I bumped into a friend of mine, or a guy who had been with me on the officers course. I think it was about, I don't know, then it was about 15, 20 years earlier. And he was the battalion commander of a reconnaissance battalion of an infantry brigade. So in Israel, every infantry brigade has a reconnaissance battalion. These guys have a reconnaissance company, an anti-tank company, and a sapper company. And these guys are like considered tactical special forces. You've got different levels of special forces. You've got your recce's at the very top, which are strategic special forces and the Navy commandos. And there's also an Air Force unit like that. And then you've got sort of another level below them. And then you've got your special forces, which are at brigade level, which are your tactical ones. So that's that. And this battalion commander, he was in command of that battalion. They'd just been set up. They'd just been established. And he needed an operations officer. So he started talking to me and said, what's happening with you? I said, I don't know. They're sending us home. They don't need us anymore. They said to me, oh, no, come and join my battalion. I need an operations officer. So I was overjoyed. It was a great honor to be in a unit like that. I mean, the soldiers there, it's not regular infantry. Those soldiers all pass a selection to get in, and it's a higher standard of soldier, and the officers too, very high standard of officers. So for me, it was a huge honor to do that. That was in a unit brigade made up of ex-Golanni soldiers. And then after, that's where I did the second Lebanese war. And then after that, I was already getting a bit old. I was now over 40, and I had a slip disc in my back, and my knees were not so great. So I had to find something a little bit less strenuous. So I was trained to be an officer that directs airstrikes. So Israel, about 6 months ago, I think in the middle of 2022, admitted that their drones are actually armed. They've been on. It's been like that for a long time, but only now they've announced it. So my job was to coordinate those airstrikes, and I did. And then after the course, I was invited to join the divisional fire center of the 98th Airborne Brigade. And those are all obviously paratroops, and I'm from Golanni, so it's like I don't know. I'm trying to think of it's like a Western Province fly-off going to a party of the Northern Transvaal rugby players. It's like you're not, you're a little bit out of place there. So, but and I also asked if I could do a jump course and stuff, but they explained to me, no. the divisional headquarters is not expected to jump in combat. So there's no reason for you to do a jump course there. And it's very expensive for the army to train paratroops. So they wouldn't, I couldn't do it. So I didn't jump, if anyone was wondering, even though I was in the paratroop division. So the divisional headquarters is made up of the operations, the intelligence, and the fire center. So I was in the fire center. Now, people, when they watch the news, often they see what the Israeli army is doing to the poor Palestinians. So this is the airstrikes. This is what I did. So I'll explain a little bit how that works. So you've got two kinds of airstrikes: the fast jets or attack helicopters, and then you've got the ones that are done by the drones, which was my responsibility. Now, if a unit needs an airstrike, they call up the HQ and they say, "Hey, listen, we've got a target here and here. We want this target taken out by a JDAM, a 500 kilo bomb or whatever." It goes to a certain officer. He's usually an Air Force officer sitting in the brigade headquarters, or if it's at divisional level in the division fire center, there's a section that's only manned by the Air Force, and it goes to them. And then it starts going through several layers of approval, this requested strike. It used to take about 2 hours from the request going in until the thing happened. It's now much, much shorter than that, but still it takes a long time. It goes through, it has to be approved by a number of different people going up in seniority. And one of the levels of approval is a team of lawyers. And they say, for example, if the target is legal according to the rules of war. Now, I mean, the one of the biggest advantages of our enemy at times of war is civilian casualties. So it's not only not the way we fight, and honestly, I'm not just saying that to sound nice, but it's not the way we fight. We don't harm civilians on purpose, ever. And when it happens, we don't like it. It's everyone gets a bit upset when it happens. It's not. I don't want to, at risk of sounding like a goody two shoes or something. It's not. It's seen as a failure. It's a professional failure if it happens. I mean, that's the way to describe it. But mistakes do happen. Now I'll explain what sort of mistakes. So mistakes can be varied. So the mistake can be of the person who ordered the airstrike. Sometimes they give the wrong coordinates. Sometimes they've even given their own coordinates, believe it or not. Then as the coordinates get passed up the chain, sometimes someone makes a mistake copying the coordinates or writing them down or whatever. Sometimes it's passed by telephone. Nowadays, it's usually by computer, so that is largely eliminated. But, mistakes can happen there. Intelligence officers can make mistakes when they say the enemy is there and the enemy is not there, or they think he's there and he's not there. There's mistakes like that. Sometimes a commander who's preparing the ground before the soldiers move in, he says, okay, before my soldiers go there, I want all these targets to be hit. And he selects the targets, and he can make a mistake and choose the wrong targets. The pilot can make a mistake. The people who prepare the munition, the armorers in the Air Force, they can make a mistake in preparing the munition. These munitions are sophisticated devices. They're all guided weapons. They're not dumb bombs. And sometimes they malfunction. It can be a mechanical malfunction, the fins or the fuse or the guidance system. A laser designator can sort of be reflected incorrectly if reflecting off a window or of water or of all sorts of things. That designate the laser target designator can be mistaken. There's 1,001 things that can go wrong, and they inevitably do. They always go wrong, and also in every war there are blue what's the word, fratricide engagements, where you engage your own side. And it happens, it always happens. And you also, civilians get hurt also by mistake. So, I mean, I just wanted to make that clear. I mean, a lot of people, it may be clear anyway, but I wanted to make it clear. You know, we don't bomb civilians on purpose. Now, there have been cases in Gaza, and there have been some famous ones where you see these whole apartment buildings collapsing, and they get bombed and stuff. And there was the one where all the press was gathered and everything. So first of all, with those ones, and this is one of the things that my guys did with the drones, is first of all, the building and everyone in the building, every telephone in that building gets called by the Israeli secret police, and they tell them, this building is going to get bombed in 15 minutes time, get out. No one must be in the building. And these buildings contain usually ammunition, like rockets, and often communications equipment, and headquarters. They are legitimate military targets. I mean, there is a good reason that every building like that is taken down. So when you see it happening, you can rest assured that it's gone through many layers of approval, probably even up to the Minister of Defense. When it's one of those big apartment buildings, the Minister of Defense approves that. They know that it's going to look really bad on TV, but they say, hey, we've got no choice. Of course, I mean, how am I for time? I can go into a few more stories here and stuff. I mean, are we okay for time?
Graeme, talk as much as you want. I'm making notes here, right? Just carry on.
Okay, so I can give you an example from when I was in Gaza in 2014. So we got intelligence that there was this unused clinic, which was a clinic that had been run by the United Nations. And it was no longer used, but it was still marked as a clinic and marked as a UN institution. And we knew that the Hamas had booby-trapped the building, and they also had a tunnel that was built from inside the building leading into Israel. And that whole operation in 2014, the whole objective of that operation was to destroy all of these tunnels that were leading into Israel. So we had to take it out. And there was this discussion in our brigade, in the headquarters where I was, a discussion of what are we going to do with this place. And I said, and a few others said, look, we should just get the Air Force and just blow the place to smithereens. And then others said, no, because it's a UN building, even though it's not used by anyone, it's deserted. And it's been deserted for many months. But I mean, tomorrow, all the headlines are going to say, Israel bombs UN clinic. You can't do that. And look, to be honest, they were probably right. So they decided what we have to do is to send soldiers in there. So they sent in a unit of special forces, which is from my division, from the 98th Airborne. And they went in there and they found explosives packed into the plaster of the walls. And they found the tunnel. And there was also, unbeknownst to them at the time, but also under the floor tiles, there were explosives. All of the floor tiles were explosives under them. And one of the soldiers set off a trigger, a booby trap, and the whole place exploded. And 3 guys got killed and another 18 were injured, some of them seriously maimed for the rest of their lives. And then the whole building collapsed. And then the Hamas opened fire on them. And then, you know, their friends were trying to dig them out of the rubble while they were under fire. And it was a massive thing. I mean, it was a chamors. So, I mean, that's an example. That's an example. I can tell you that the opposition, they use every dirty trick in the book. They dress up like Israeli soldiers. They dress up as aid workers. They dress up as ambulance men. They carry their soldiers in ambulances. They dress up as journalists. They dress up as women. I mean, you see a deserted street, and you know the whole area has been deserted. All the civilians have left, and suddenly you see these 2 women walking down the street, like marching in step, you know, like soldiers do, but they dressed as women, and just like, you know, these are not women, but even then we didn't attack them. I mean, we could have, but it's not enough. Even though you know that those are Hamas terrorists, you can't attack them, and we didn't. So then, just getting back to that was the one kind of airstrike which I was talking about. So then there's the other kind which I did with the drone. So with us, we are dedicated to targets which are called TCT, or time constrained targets. Now these targets they appear for a matter of seconds, or maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then they're gone. So you can't request an airstrike and send it up through the chain of command and have the lawyers look at it and the intelligence officers will think about it, and you can't do all this stuff, because they you know, by the time they make a decision, they're gone. So the munition that the drones were carrying at the time that we were using there, it's a small munition. It's the warhead's about the size of an RPG. It's got a small kill radius, very small. And it means that you can, so often the Hamas like to stand in a group of civilians. Amongst them, the Hamas soldiers, or terrorists, or whatever you want to call them, they stand amongst the civilians. So you can even get a guy if he's not like really too close to the civilians, you can, with one of these munitions, you can get him, and you won't hurt the civilians. But you've got to be very careful, obviously. I mean, it's just a tricky game. And the big danger is also, we often providing close air support. So these guys, the guys who operate, who are firing the munitions or dropping the munitions, whatever they were doing, they use a thermal camera, a FLIR, forward-looking infrared camera. So whoever's familiar with that out of the viewers will know it's a very grainy picture, black and white, or sort of white and green shaded sort of colors. And it's very difficult to tell if it's your side or their side, especially when they're dressed like you are, and they even carry your own weapon, the same weapons as you. I mean, the Hamas soldiers there, they go to the lengths of, I don't know if you've seen the Israeli soldiers have these camouflage nets on their helmets to break the shape of the helmet. It's like it comes like a big thing like this. The Hamas wore those as well. They even, you know, how you have to blouse your trousers at the bottom above your boots with elastic, so that the trousers are like held onto your boots. They even did that. I mean, so I mean, when you're looking through a FLIR picture, it's very hard to see if it's there's ways and means that the guys who operating the drones, they can tell whether it's ours or theirs. But it's often a difficult thing to do. And there's a very famous case. I mean, I'm sure they still show this. When I did my training as an airstrike officer, they showed us a case where about 10 Israeli soldiers had gone onto a flat rooftop, and they were commanded by a platoon commander, and he thought he was on one street away from where he actually was. He was mistaken in his position. So he reported, they said, "Where are you?" He said, I'm in such and such a place. But he wasn't. He was in the wrong place, but he didn't know. And then everyone's looking, and the drone operator found this rooftop with 10 soldiers there with guns and everything, and they're lying down and they're aiming and everything, and you know, and it's like, and everyone's trying to find out, are they ours or theirs? And there's this whole conversation going on. You can hear it's all recorded in this film that they showed us. It's all recorded there in the headquarters between the airstrike coordinator, which is what I did, the brigade chief of staff, which is the number 3 officer in the brigade. He commands the headquarters, and the mission commander of the drone. The 3 of them trying to decide, it's us or them. And they're talking on the radio. They talk to this platoon commander. He's like, "Are you sure you are not in this place?" "Yes, I'm sure I'm not in this house." And they said to the drone guy, "Okay, you are clear to fire. Shoot." And it, like, literally at the last minute, the airstrike coordinator, who's a colleague of mine, he understood, he realized, the penny dropped. He saw the soldiers do something. It was something like that in the behavior of the soldiers. He realized that it's ours. He said, "Ceasefire." and he stopped at the last minute. They almost took out 10 soldiers. And this is the sort of thing, this is the sort of danger with close air support that you have when you're operating a drone. So it's very tricky. So yeah, so that's a little bit about airstrikes. But whoever's interested and whoever's curious, you can read my book. So there you go. Chris, any questions? I think I've more or less covered it.
Graeme, I've got a lot of questions. And again, I want to thank you for coming here. I find your views extremely fascinating because I can see there's a different view here, and I'm not actually qualified to answer you on the Angolan thing, all your comments there. But I'm sure we can bring people who can have like a group discussion between you two. Who was there?
Definitely.
Who can tell us? I was not there on those ops, so I don't know. But my mind was racing when you were telling me these things. It was racing because many of the general officers I spoke to on these channels, on this channel, said to me that they were on a political restraint, something dreadful. They could not lose white people. That's why, in my opinion, I might be wrong, a place like 3-2 Battalion was abused. If you listen to the former commander speaking, where he said they were being sent right into trying to stop a FOPLA brigade of tanks. And head officers were talking about something like chains which they had to put across the trees. And I still to this day cannot understand what the hell they wanted to do with those chains, because we were hanging landmines on it or whatever, but he flatly refused. He flatly refused, and by refusing, we relieved him of his command, and then he saved 3-2 Battalion. He actually saved 3-2 Battalion in its entirety by refusing his stupid orders. But I really find it interesting to me. And I'm going to put your book links here also, and I'm inviting you back to come and talk about your book as well, as much as details as you can give us, of course. Now, I have a few questions if I can quickly ask you. In the 1990s in South Africa, suddenly there came out all these anti-SADF books and people, and you know what? It was the funniest thing. That's when I actually realized we lost the war. Because there was nobody there who was actually on the side of us. They were all secret ANC members, things like that. He was very quiet about that during that time. I mean, he never said anything. So he was talking bullshit. He was just playing politics. And even a book came out called An Unpopular War, which I have to say it's the only book I ever read and threw away afterwards. I was that disgusted with it. It was totally against what I stood for and still stand for. I was very happy to go to the borders. I was very happy to serve. Man, I loved it. It was the time of my life. If I could be a young man again, same circumstances, I'll grab that R1 rifle. I'll go. That was me, man. I answered the call. Now, was it in Israel? Is it popular to serve there to this day, or in your time, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. So look, there's no simple answer for that. There's groups of the population who don't serve, like the ultra-religious, the ones you see dressed in black and everything. They refuse to serve. They just live off the taxpayers' money, and they don't work either. So they don't even pay tax. They just live with the tax. So they're very unpopular, and they don't. And then there's another segment of the population which are like, I guess you could call them the far left. A lot of them don't serve, or if they serve, they just will serve in the rear echelon. They'll go to an office or something and they'll do nothing. They'll just then you've got another section of the population which is still quite big, which see the services as a rite of passage. They see it as a very important contribution to the country, and they take it very seriously. And look, my attitude also when I knew I was being called up for getting my emergency call up to go to the war and stuff, it was like going to your Olympic Games. You know, it's like you've trained all this time and prepared all this time, and gone through so much to reach this point, and now is the time. So it's like, yes, let's go and do it. We're like, at the same time, you have very mixed feelings. You have that. You also, obviously, I'll be honest. I felt a bit, a certain level of apprehension as well. To be honest, it's funny. Before you cross the border, I felt it. Or before we crossed the border, I felt it. But after you cross the border, it's gone. It's disappeared. You're not scared anymore. I didn't feel fear once after the crossing the border. But before, you sort of like, you're sitting and you're waiting, and it's like, it's like when you're at school and you have to go to the headmaster's office and you're waiting outside. It's like that sort of thing. So look, a lot of people do take it seriously. Then you've got reserves. Now, reserves used to be almost like the regular service with regards to the popularity of the service and everything. But nowadays, many people don't want to go to reserves. And I'd say maybe less than 20% of the male population does reserves. And a lot of them sort of see it as a kind of a sort of, some people do volunteer activities to the community and stuff. So a lot of people see their reserve service as a kind of a volunteer service to the community. And if you are told that you have to go and do reserves and you don't want to, it's really easy to get out of it. And the army doesn't want to deal with people that are going to make problems and stuff. So if someone makes it clear that they don't want to do reserves, the army doesn't want to hassle with them. They just let them go. So reserve service is not a lot of people that do reserves anymore, and the people who do it are viewed as kind of a lot of people look at them as if they're suckers. They just they kind of not being taken advantage of, but they kind of like doing something that they don't have to do. It's just they're doing something unpleasant that they don't have to do, and they sort of like why do you even bother? Like, why do you do it? Like, you don't have to do that. Like, why do you do it? Sort of attitude. Obviously, I never thought like that. I really don't like people who say those sort of things. I never sort of did like them, but there's lots of them. And there's also a problem in Israel with their employers. So employers don't like it if you do reserves, because you disappear, you go. And then thankfully the employer doesn't have to pay your salary while you're away. The Social Security does. But still, the business suffers when you're not there. And if they ever have to do layoffs, and often in the private sector they do layoffs, they look at everyone. They say, okay, who's not performing? Who does reserves? And they let them go. And you're not allowed to fire someone because they do reserves in Israel by law. But the employers will always find a legitimate reason to fire someone who's doing too much reserves. So it's not popular. It's not popular. And look, a reservist, and to go off to reserves, like, imagine you're living your life like you're a lawyer. So imagine being a lawyer, and then suddenly 3 days later you find yourself in a battlefield, and you've got a wife and kids at home and a mortgage, and what? Okay, am I going to get killed now? What's going to happen to my wife and kids? And it's like, it's not like you're 19 years old and it's oorwinlik. It's not like that anymore. You're not indestructible anymore. So it's and I think a lot of the permanent force officers also regard the reserves as with a little bit of like how reliable are these guys? I mean, how serious are they going to be when the push comes to shove, sort of thing? Well, I'll tell you what, in 2006, when we went in, I mean, we did what we were supposed to do. I mean, we've got nothing to be ashamed of. Let's put it that way. And we were reservists. But yeah, that's the reality of it.
I have some sympathy here because our other presenter, Andrew Whittaker, he made a comment once. He said, I went to 1SAI in Bloemfontein, 1 Infantry, went on 6-1 Meg, went on these officers. Then he went home. Then he became an auditor because they are auditors. That's all they do. That's his entire family. I think his auditing firm is tomorrow 90 years old. Started with his grandfather, his father, him, and now his son is taking over. Thank God, so he can help us here with legacy. But he said he stayed a troopie. Even though he was now this auditor with his own auditing firm, he was still running around in the bush with a rifle, which I found just typical army. It was too funny. But I've heard about something, Graeme. I've heard that one of your supermodels sort of dodged service. I'm not sure how she did it. The story I've heard is she got married unexpectedly to almost a family member. And please, if I'm wrong, forgive me. But how
No,
would
that's
people
true.
feel
No,
about that? Did that happen? It's
there are, especially girls do that. The rule is if you're married, you don't have to do military service. So a lot of the girls used to get out. Look, to be fair, say 20 years ago, there were not many things that a girl could do in the army that were really interesting. They were often just put in the office jobs. There were some training jobs, instructor jobs that they could do, which were nice, but the majority didn't have an interesting service. So they just saw it as a waste of 2 years. So you would see it happen where these people would get out of it like that. And this particular model, I think you're referring to Barafeli, her name is. Look, she got a lot of flack because of that afterwards. She copped a lot of flack. It didn't. There's a segment of the population which didn't care, but there are a lot of people that also did care. Then you've got someone else like Gal Gadot for Wonder Woman. So she, for example, she did her army service, and she makes a point of it, and she's very proud of it, and everyone loves her for it. So you've got both examples.
I've heard that the Israeli army experimented with female tank crews, Merkava crews, but they stopped it for some reason. Is that
Yes.
true as well? Did that happen?
There was a trial, but they sort of ran the trial. They stopped it, and then they've restarted it. Now it's been approved. So now females can serve in the armored corps. Yeah, but it's there's a lot of sort of controversy around that, because it's not just a question of chauvinism or something like that. It's because, look, in the tank, the guys often spend days in the tank, and they can't get out of the tank. I mean, they have to go to the toilet inside the tank. I mean, it's a very intimate space, and to have boys and girls together in the tank, it's not so. So it's a bit of a problem. But I think they found solutions to the problem. And there's also a bit of there are some soldiers which sort of didn't like the fact that girls were also doing the job, not because they thought that the girls were not capable of doing it, but it's sort of like harmed their prestige, like as if it's the armored corps is not tough enough. It's not tough enough. It's that it's only for guys. It's it's not like special forces or something, But that's just silliness. I mean, they'll get over it. The Air Force had the same thing when women were allowed to be pilots. By the way, it was an ex-South African girl, Alice Miller, is the name. She's South African. She went to the Supreme Court and got the Supreme Court to force the Air Force to allow girls to do the pilot course. And in the beginning, there was a lot of pushback from the pilots. The pilots felt like, like everyone's going to look at us as if we're women, sort of thing. There was a bit of that attitude, and for a long time, that existed, but it's gone away. And the same will happen here. People get used to it. There's no reason not to. Same thing's happening in the Navy. The ships have mixed crews. I think it's great, and look, it's the future, and I think there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that story with a South African girl who sued them to the Supreme Court. I think it's in one of the books, codename Blue Tang. The story is told there. I think the head of the Air Force, who was a great fighter pilot, great ace, said something to her that she should go and knit socks or something. He had this funny way of looking at it. But they are now, they are flying, and they are flying combat. Which brings me to the
fashion.
following point.
Yeah.
Your prisoners of wars are not treated well. I have statistics where during the Yom Kippur, some Syrian guy got actually a medal for beheading you people or killing you with a spade or a baseball bat or something.
Yeah.
Most dreadful, most dreadful. And those who came back from captivity, the medical report stated that most of them, well, all of them, were most severely abused, cigarette burns, beatings, starvations. God knows you,
Yes.
you mentioned it and they did it. Are you people specially trained with
Yes.
a prisoner of war type of situation?
Only the special forces and the pilots are. I mean, it's too difficult. I mean, that kind of training, it's very harsh psychologically, and I've heard that it's very difficult to go through it. I mean, yeah, they only do it to the pilots and the special forces. But we know that that's. I mean, the other side doesn't look at the Geneva Convention. They're like absolute savages when they catch prisoners, which is why the Israeli soldiers don't like surrendering. They don't surrender very often. So that's the reason.
Yeah, I can't say I blame you. I understand there was a minor, how can you put it, but some colonel of yours, or lieutenant colonel, flatly forbade his men. He sent out an order to say you will not surrender on any condition. I've read such a thing somewhere. And I fully understand why, because they will be treated like that. And that's the stupidity of this. Now you have to fight the guy all the
I don't
time.
think. Yeah, I don't think an officer has to even say that to his soldiers. I mean, the soldiers know. I mean, they know what's going to happen. They don't need anyone to tell them don't surrender. I mean, there was a case in 1982 in the First Lebanon War where 8 soldiers of so I mentioned previously there's this infantry brigade which is of a less prestigious one. It's called the Nachal. So the Nachal today is different from the Nachal of 1982. It's much better. But at the time they didn't have a strong fighting spirit, and there were 8 soldiers on a hilltop somewhere in Lebanon, and three terrorists came, walked up to them and said, you're now prisoners. And they didn't fight back, and they didn't do anything, and they were disgraced. I mean, and then Israel, to release them, had to release about 1,000 prisoners or something of the other side, and they brought such shame upon their brigade, and their brigade for many years was held in low esteem because of what these 8 people did. And in Golanni, and one of the things that we do in the Israeli army, like we sing songs, the soldiers all together, we sing. We have all sorts of songs, and we used to sing songs about the Nachal, because we used to tease them because of how they got, how they just gave up. But nowadays, I don't think anyone would want to fall into captivity. It's too dreadful to imagine.
I hate to ask this of you, Graeme, but do you think it's religious? Is that the reason why a Jewish soldier, Israeli soldier, will be treated that badly almost always?
No, I think that's how they treat even each other. I mean, like when you look at the Syrian civil war, when they caught each other, they chopped their heads off and stuff. I mean, they just that's how they live. I mean, that's how they are. That's the cultural norm. They just treat prisoners very badly. It's also that look, they really don't like the Jews, and there's a general sort of attitude in the Middle East that the Middle East is for Muslims, and Muslims want to get everyone who's not a Muslim out of the Middle East. And that is what's happening with Israel now. It's like white men in Africa. It's a bit like that. It's just that the Jews have been in the Middle East for 3,000 years. They were there long before there was Islam. But never mind. That's another conversation. But yeah, that's the attitude.
I'm glad you mentioned that. For those who don't know, Islam came recently in the 9th century about, and they have almost
700
the same religion as
something
Catholics.
AD.
Catholics. Yeah, when Muhammad, well, it's not going to that. I will get banned. Read the books. When what I want to ask you is I recall my time in South Africa in the police. We would go into the townships, as they were called then, and we were there for a damn reason. And the reason was because these people were killing each other. And we were trying to keep peace. Funny enough. But when you go into that township,
Nkata and all that.
yeah, and the Wituke and what have you know what, it was just chaos. Chaos. Barbarism. There's no word for it. And you would go in there and you would actually feel the hatred suddenly against you. Is that the same thing which you would feel if you would cross the border into Lebanon or somewhere to conduct an operation? Or are the locals not that violently against you once there's nobody looking at them, you know, if they can actually act normal, not for the cameras?
Again, you've asked an interesting question. So look, in 1982, when the Israelis went into Lebanon, they went in there because the Palestinians had taken over South Lebanon. And they'd been abusing the local population of South Lebanon, much of which was Shia. And the Shia today are pro-Iran, pro-Hezbollah. They're the number one enemy of Israel. But at the time, in 1982, when the soldiers came in and they kicked out the Palestinians, the Shia residents of South Lebanon greeted the Israelis with cheers, and they threw rice on them. It's like a kind of a traditional greeting for heroes, is throwing rice at them. And that's what they did. A few short years later already, it turned 180 degrees the opposite. But look, nowadays, if we go into Lebanon, it's going to be a big mess. The Hezbollah is very strong. The Hezbollah is stronger than most NATO countries. They've got something like 150,000 artillery rockets of a caliber of 122 millimeters and up. It's a lot of firepower, and not to mention a whole lot of other stuff. I mean, that's just the rockets. But if we go into the Palestinian areas, you feel it straight away. You can cut the atmosphere with a knife. I mean, the tension and the hatred in the air, it's very, very strong. But having said that, look, there's a lot of people in the Palestinian side who sort of like kind of trapped, and they just want to live their lives, and they want to live a good life, and they don't want to fight anyone, and they just want to do their thing and, you know, bring up their kids, but they can't make their voices heard. They won't let them. The dominant voices in the Palestinian areas are the voices of Hamas, and to a lesser extent, the Palestinian Authority. If there were elections today in the West Bank, what's called the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the Hamas would probably take 85% of the vote, if not more, which is why the Palestinian Authority doesn't hold elections for that reason. I mean, they did it in Gaza, and Hamas threw them out. And they threw them out violently. They killed hundreds of them. So, yeah.
And just for those who don't quite understand what you mean, yeah, Hamas is a movement. In the old days, you would have called it a terrorist group. But right now, you will say it's actually an army. It's not more a few guys with AKs taking pot shots at people. This is a serious threat.
Yes, the short answer is that's exactly correct. So their soldiers are very highly trained. The ones in Gaza, they're trained by the Iranians, they're trained by the Algerians. They are very well trained and very formidable. And it's an Islamic movement, which is sort of it's a movement which becomes a government. So they're all encompassing. They look after all aspects of life: health, education, welfare, and the military and religion and everything. It's like a one-stop shop for everything. That's the Hamas. And the Hezbollah is the same. The Hamas is of the Sunni Muslims, and the Hezbollah is of the Shia Muslims. So you've got two groups of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. So most of the Palestinians are Sunni, the vast majority. And the Lebanese have different groups, among them also Shia and Sunni. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a complex situation, isn't it? But I hold the opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, Israel cannot afford to lose a war. If you lose a conventional war, like in collapsing, your army collapses and run away like, this rubbish we had in Afghanistan, you people will be wiped out. There'll be nothing left of you. Am I correct if I say it
For
has
sure.
gone to...
Yes, Israel can't afford to lose a war. You can't. I mean, look, the closest thing, twice you could say we've been close to losing a war. One was in 1973 when Israel was surprised and there was a big intelligence failure. And so there were like 3 or 4 days when it was a bit hectic and it wasn't looking too good, but the equilibrium was regained, and in the end there was a battlefield victory. Some people would argue that the political outcome was an Egyptian victory because they got the Sinai back, but that's a kind of a win-win situation because Israel also gained a lot from that, even though they gave the Sinai back. But and then the other time that the Israeli army did really badly in war was in 2006, in the war that I was in. And as I said, I mean, that's to explain that whole war and why things went wrong and what went wrong. It's a good hour-and-a-half conversation. So I mean, probably better that we don't start it now. But those are the 2 times it happened. And in 2006, it wasn't because the other side, the opposition, did well. It's not because the Hezbollah was so good. It's just because we were so bad. So yeah. But I think it was good in a way that it happened because it gave us it was a wake-up call, and the army had to shake itself very thoroughly afterwards, and it did. And so in some ways it's a good thing that it happened.
Yeah, you invited back to talk about that because I understand you lost a lot of Merkavas, and I read the books and reports. If I say lost, it does not mean it's completely lost. I just mean it was shot out if you were being penetrated. They were not equipped with what they had to, which I thought they should have. Things like smoke for their tanks, to grenades, things like that. They were simply not there. So there were a lot of mistakes made, but you invited, come back. Let's talk about that specific incident as well.
Yes, no, that's also interesting. I mean, there's a whole lot of there are many interesting aspects to that war, and the performance of the armor is also one of them. The Merkava tank, and I mean, it's today's Merkava tank is not the same Merkava tank of 2006. It's not. It's been vastly improved. I mean, one of the things that they've got now is what's it called? A trophy. It's like Iron Dome, but just for the tank. It's a kind of a missile that gets shot out and it intercepts the incoming missile or heat shell which is coming in to hit the tank. So I mean, yeah, but as I said, it's a subject for another day.
Yeah, no, they actually defeat the incoming missiles. They shoot it down. It's a fantastic system, like so many of Israeli systems. Now, as far as I understand the Jewish faith, taking life is not a easy thing for you people. You're not really murderers. You don't actually like killing. And I know that the Israeli Air Force had a small mutiny a few years ago where the Apache pilots flatly refused to launch after some innocents were killed because of bad intelligence. So I'm very glad that you were speaking to me out of the blue. I didn't know you were going to say that. And what care you take these days before you would actually launch, even with the drones. It seems to me you've evolved quite far away from let's shoot and worry about it later to where you're now and say, this is not our tradition. If we have to kill, we'll kill. But it's not a joke. Am I correct if I summarize it like that?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I mean, look, when we're in the, I can talk about infantry, for example. Like when we were in the headquarters, I was in the brigade headquarters and divisional headquarters at times of war, and I was part of the planning process. I can tell you something like a third of the time spent on planning of the battle is all about how we avoid civilian casualties. You know, where there's a hospital, where there's a school, and where there's a mosque. Having said that, the mosques are often used to store ammunition. So, I mean, you got to be careful with that. But literally a third of the time of the planning process is all about avoiding civilian casualties. So we do make a big effort. I mean, there's statistics as well. I mean, you can look, and again, I mean, this can easily become a long conversation. I don't know if we've got time for it, but if you look at the number of combatant casualties versus civilian casualties in different wars, you can look at World War II, where you had millions of civilian casualties and hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed. You can look at wars like Vietnam. You can look at wars like South Africa's border war. You can look at Afghanistan, Iraq, the French in Mali a few years ago. All of those wars, how many combatants versus civilians are killed? If you look at Israeli wars using the exact metric, you will see the lowest ratio of civilians versus combatants killed. What I'm saying is that you've got a much higher proportion of combatants versus civilians that are killed, which I think says everything. And whoever wants to fact check me, the numbers are in Wikipedia. You can just go into Wikipedia and just work it out. I mean, you don't take my word for it.
No, well, we can make comparisons, which I know for a fact. I mean, at one stage, the US drone program were killing 96.5% of the time the wrong people. It's not that the missile actually would hit the wrong target. No, it would hit the right where they aimed it, but 96.5%. And again, I would say to you guys, if you don't believe me, go and do research. You will find out I'm actually telling the truth. Now, the Israeli drone program isn't even close to that. I mean, it is the other way around. It's really...
Yes, correct.
But you're fighting against an enemy which is clever. We have to say that. They are clever. They do have access to the media. And that's what I want to ask you now. How do you deal with it as an Israeli officer when stupid people come and they say to you, you're a bunch of murderers, you're killers, you know? People seem to think to me these days, have lost the capability to think. They would say something like, Palestine good, Israel bad, end of story. And they do not realize there's actually a lot more to it than that story. I mean, we've went through it during apartheid as well. We could do nothing right, even though we did a lot more good than what people credit us. And I'm not standing for apartheid. I'm just saying we did a lot of good as well, especially the Army. The Army and the Air Force during the wars, like you people, would actually warn. They would drop leaflets to say, get out of this area. They would have a small plane there with somebody speaking the local language, telling them to get out because there's going to be a strike. In the police, in my own days, we would warn them, guys, you're busy with the illegal gathering here. You better leave. Otherwise, there's going to be trouble. Then, of course, they see that as calm. And then you look to the left and there's CNN and the rest of the bankers, the rest of the journalists there, that side, and they're taking the pictures. I am very sure that they're trying to trap you people also like that all the time. So how do you answer these criticisms?
All the time.
Yeah, is it even worth your while to try to explain to them?
Look, let me start the answer by saying that I think that Israel does a very bad job of handling that. I think that the reason they do a very bad job is probably based on 2 or 3 things. First of all, the Israelis, because they speak Hebrew and no other country in the world speaks Hebrew, and their English is a very far second, they're not really aware of what everyone else is saying, like the average Israeli in the street. They're not really aware of it. They don't know how bad it is. That's the one thing. The ones that do know, especially the ones who are responsible for it, I think they've given up trying. They don't see much point in trying, in trying to win that propaganda war. And look, I mean, they're just up against it's such an unequal fight. I mean, you're up against the entire media of not only of the West, but of the media of the world. I mean, like they're all out for you, you know, and they're all backing the other side. It's like you can't win. It's like you know, why play the game when you know you haven't got a chance? It's like that sort of thing. And in the field, you do come across the journalists sometimes, and we see the journalists trying to incite violence because it's good for their cameras. I've seen that happen a lot, especially in the old days, back in the 80s. They used to do that a lot, the journalists. But generally, when we see the journalists, we just ignore them. I mean, you know, we've got more important things to do. We just ignore them. Yeah.
So there's no special hatred from Israeli side towards the Arabs.
Look, again, when you've got a population of 7 million people, you're going to have all sorts of opinions. You're going to have everything there. There are groups in the far right, which I suppose they would, if they would describe themselves, they would say maybe that they hate the Arabs. But I mean, that's like it's an unsophisticated and unintelligent way to look at something. I mean, it's like, why hate why hate anyone unless you've got a super good reason for it, you know? It's like, and for that reason, I don't think there are many that hate Arabs blindly. I honestly don't think so. In the army, there's lots of Arabs who serve in the army, lots. And we're very good friends with them. I mean, in my brigade, in the Golanni brigade, we've had commanders who were Arabs, of the brigade commanders. And we've had battalion commanders. One famous battalion commander was actually killed, a guy called Hussein. As an Arab guy, commanded a battalion. And everyone was very close to them. So it's not, you know, the media often, when they don't understand a problem, when a journalist doesn't understand something to a great depth, they will simplify everything and they'll put it in very simple terms. And the people who are watching it will understand 50% of what he said or less, and they will understand it in even more simple terms. And then the basic understanding of the problem around the world is generally very low. And they just have these impressions of Israelis bombing apartment buildings, and you have these extremist settlers, which is maybe like 200 of them in a population of 7 million, who go into the Arab villages and set cars alight and do things like that. Look, the Arabs have been doing it to the Israelis, the Israeli settlers, for 30 years, burning their cars and throwing rocks at them and killing them and making their life an absolute misery. They've been doing it for 30 years and no one says anything. And now when the Israelis are starting to do it back because they've had enough and they've like this hutful, you know, now everyone's upset. But what can you do? That's how it is.
I'll ask you a last question here. If you could have had your life over, when it's not possible, we know that, would you have made the same decisions?
Oh, look, I mean, wouldn't we all love to be 18 and have the knowledge that we have today? But yeah, look, probably a lot of them, but I would make that I think all of us we'd probably do a lot the same, but better. That's what I like to think.
Graeme, I want to thank you. I want to say to you again, thank you so much for coming here. I really enjoyed this talk. I am certain we're going to see you again here. And to the rest of you guys out there, you know what I'm going to say to you. Don't let your stories die with you. Come and talk to us. Come to Legacy. Come and tell us. You know, a few years from now, people are going to watch us and say, hey, I remember that one. And, you know, we'll perhaps drink a whiskey or a beer on you, things like that. Come and talk to us. Graeme, always welcome. And everybody from Israel.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome at Legacy. You'll always have an open door. So until we meet again.
Thank you very much.
God bless you all.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. I appreciate it. Chris, sorry, just one other thing I thought I would just add.
regarding differences between the two armies. So one thing that's quite interesting with the Israeli army is that we don't spend any time doing parades and drilling on the parade ground and all that stuff. If I would put together all of the time that I spent in my army service on parades and drilling, I'd maybe get to 18 hours in total. So I can also say that if a foreign military observer would ever see us in a parade, they would probably be absolutely appalled. You know, we look like a bunch of kids or something, like pretending. It really doesn't look very good. The reason we don't do that at all is that it's time consuming, and the time is spent training and learning how to fight, basically, and practicing all the various things. So it's the parades and stuff, it's just considered a waste of time. Also, I know that in inspection in the South African Army, I remember one thing that made a deep impression upon me is how each person has to iron his bed. and you know, a huge amount of time is spent in polishing your boots and all this stuff. So with us, the inspection, there's no influence on that. There's no emphasis on that. So we, for example, when you have to prepare your bed, it just has to be neat, just like at home, like you know, like a civilian would neatly make their bed, just put a blanket over it and stuff, and your sleeping bag is rolled up properly and tied. That's all you need to do. Your equipment is all laid out on your bed in the inspection. It's disassembled and it has to be clean. And the emphasis is that it's in tip-top condition, clean, and working condition, and as it should be. I mean, that's basically it. That's, you know, there's always a practical emphasis on everything. So practicality is key. So when your equipment is being inspected, it has to work perfectly, has to be perfectly clean, the equipment itself. So not like polishing your boots so that they're like mirrors, but your weapon has to be perfectly clean and lightly oiled. Another thing, you asked me about the British Army influence. So of course the short answer is yes. We do have British Army influence in all three branches: Air Force, Navy, and the Army. We had the Jewish Brigade in the Second World War, as you pointed out, and that brought significant British influence over. Another huge source of influence was a British officer, which many of you may be familiar with. He's quite famous, Ord Wingate. He led what were called the Chindits in Burma, and eventually he was killed. I think it was in an air crash. Unfortunately, he was killed. He was a brilliant officer, very unconventional, very different from your average British officer. Also, one of these guys who a little bit like the British SAS. They had no time for spit and polish and the parade ground stuff. They're not interested in that. And they were very innovative with everything with regards to tactics and you know, the new ways of doing things. And Ord Wingate was posted to what was then called the British Mandate of Palestine during the 1930s. And he was unusual amongst the British officers there at the times, that he had sympathy for the Jewish people in the area rather than the Arab people, because most of the British officers who were posted there had their sympathies with the Arabs. But Wingate took it upon himself to train the units which were the precursors of the IDF. So there were two units. So before the actual state of Israel was established in 1948, they had these militias. So basically, there was one called the Haganah, which is a Hebrew word for defense. It was a militia which is like just used to defend isolated villages and things like that who were under constant attack from the Arabs. And their level of training was pretty, maybe you could say basic for the time, for the 1930s. Just generally basic, sort of firearms proficient, small arms proficient. And I'm just talking rifles and pistols. They didn't even have light machine guns or anything at the time. Then they had like a kind of an elite force, which they called the Palmach, which was much smaller. I'm trying to remember what the size of the Palmach would have been. It's probably just in a couple of companies or maybe a battalion, but they were all spread out.
they never operated as a company. They'd be divided up into little units, and they would do raids in the middle of the night and things like that. And those, the Palmach, they were also called the night squads. And Ord Wingate was the one who trained them and taught the Israelis how to behave operationally at night, how to move through territory very quietly, stealthily, and small unit tactics. All of that stuff, Ord Wingate taught the Israelis, and they built upon that knowledge in a great way. And he was probably the biggest British influence on the Israeli army.